No sound. Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Apologies if you didn't get any sound with the introductory slides. So now that the festivals are behind us, we're looking forward to presenting our weekly programme up until the end of the year and indeed beyond that. So welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And once again, it's a pleasure to welcome viewers from across the globe. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Charles Dellheim. I'll introduce Charles in just a moment. A little housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As always, we'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also mention the chat facility. This will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, we are recording this event. It will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the coming days. There you will find recordings of our previous events as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. Now to our guest this evening. Charles Dellheim is a professor of history and Jewish studies at Boston University. Born in New York City, he earned his doctorate in modern European cultural history at Yale University. He's written on many subjects ranging from architecture, painting and company culture to politics, literature and baseball. His recent book is this one, Belonging and Betrayal, and that's going to be the basis of our conversation this evening. He joins us from Newton Highlands, just outside of Boston. Charles, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. The last time I was in Leeds, I acquired a magnificent yellow Labrador puppy in Doncaster. So I'm sorry that I'm not with you again today.
Well, I don't know that Doncaster is well known for Labradors, but it's certainly not too far away from here, and fascinating that you know this part of the world. So for those, and I'm assuming much of our audience haven't read your book, what's it about?
Well, the book tells the story of a group of Jewish outsiders, art dealers, collectors, art historians, and not least artists. It stretches from the late 19th century to the present, and it spans Europe and the United States. And the basic question of the book is about the rise and fall of these dealers, how they came to acquire so many great old and modern works of art. And it's a circle of people who both knew each other and worked together, but also worked against each other. And it is really a group portrait over time.
And it's an epic work. I mean, before we get to the notes, it's almost 600 pages long. How long did it take you to write this?
Well, I like to say that I still had blonde hair when I began the book, but in fact, my hair was not blonde. I have to admit that. I had the idea of writing the book in 2001, and I began working on it when I came to Boston University as head of department and professor of history, and then had a big administrative role as head of a college. So most of my time was devoted to my teaching duties, my administrative duties, and not least to my family. And it was a hard book to write, I have to say, much harder than I thought it was going to be. It was supposed to be a short book written in a relatively short period of time, and neither proved to be true.
The events you're writing about are from many years ago. Has this story been told before to any extent? And you know, why do you think the story as you've told it hasn't been put across previously?
The story really hasn't been told as a whole. There are biographies of a few of the major figures, but they are largely ahistorical, and they take up a very different theme than I do and very different questions. And there are a number of reasons why the story really hasn't been told before. The first is, in an intellectual sense, telling it requires pretty extensive work in three fields: European history, Jewish history, and art history. And that's a tough balancing act. But to a large extent, art historians tend to focus on collectors and on patronage and have less interest in the vicissitudes of business. There's also a certain amount of reticence in the world of Jewish studies about the subject of Jews and money, the fear of inadvertently summoning up Shylock's shadow and this whole body of myths. And one thing that makes it particularly complicated is that whenever you hear that a Jewish minority is disproportionately involved in a particular sphere, watch out. There's concern that about the implications of this. But the largest reason really is about the fate of Nazi stolen art. Nazi stolen art was a story that came again into public view in the late 1990s. And what I do in the book is to turn the story on its head. So rather than focus on the darkly enthralling story of how Nazis and their collaborators ransacked Jewish-owned collections, what I'm interested in is how these Jewish outsiders, against all odds, came to play a pivotal role in the art world in the first place. How did they acquire so many great old and modern masters? And what does this reveal about Jews' art and modernity?
So we'll come to talk about these themes in due course. I'm interested in your motivation for writing this book. Was there something specific that made you want to tell this story?
Well, I think the best way I can really explain it is, and I don't know who to attribute this to, but it's not my idea, that one of the major reasons for writing a book goes something like this. It's not this way, it's that way. And in the late 1990s, and really subsequently, there's been a great deal of interest, a resurgence of interest in the fate of Nazi stolen art. And there have been bitter disputes about their legal ownership and also bitter disputes about moral questions. And I was very interested in these issues. I teach modern European cultural history. I come from, on my dad's side, from a family of German Jewish refugees. So these are questions that really do interest me. But I also became concerned that too much attention was being given to questions of restitution and ownership, important as they absolutely are, and not enough attention to the people who came to acquire these works of art, what it meant to them, what role they played in European culture, how to account for their rise and fall. So the purpose of Belonging and Betrayal, in a sense, is to turn the story of Nazi stolen art on its head.
Mm. And I think that would be interesting to talk about why some of these people wanted to acquire art in due course. What was the point where European Jews began dealing in art, and what was it about this profession that either attracted them or enabled them to be participants?
So, when you're talking about a cluster of Jews coming to play a very significant role in the art world, it happens rather suddenly in the late 19th century in Europe. And the motivations are varied. And first, you have to credit the role of accident or contingency. A number of the major figures that I write about did not come to art dealing out of some deliberate planning or some kind of strategy. I'll just give you an example. Nathan Wildenstein is born in the mid 19th century in a small, very small village in Alsace. And he is the son and grandson of horse dealers. And he was, for a time, a horse dealer himself. He had a very rudimentary education. And during the Franco Prussian War, he left Alsace and went to Paris to seek his fortune. But Paris was under siege, and he ended up doing military service and then settling in a town named Vitry-le-Français. He works as a tailor's assistant, as a textile merchant. And one day a client came to him with an extraordinary request. I have a picture to sell. Can you sell it for me? And Nathan, who was the sort of man who thought he could sell anything to anyone and who was certainly in need of money and in need of opportunity, simply said yes. The problem was he knew absolutely nothing about art. And undeterred by this, he troops off to Paris and he goes to the Louvre and he spends 10 days there among its heavenly delights. And somehow or other, he was able to figure out the fact that the picture in question came from the school of Van Dyck. He sells the picture for his client, and this launches him very gradually on his career. Joel Duveen, Dutch immigrant to England, ends up in Yorkshire, but in Hull, in the 1860s. He sells vegetable produce to grocers thanks to an introduction from one of his uncles. He too knows nothing about art, or virtually nothing. And on a trip back to Holland, Easter in the late 1860s, brother-in-law Barnett, and in the warehouse of his uncle Yap, and they see a load of blue and white Delft china. Nothing extraordinary, but interesting enough for them to buy a quantity of it and to sell it to grocers. And gradually, Joel decides that this will be a more lucrative sideline. In a more general sense, though, art dealing conforms to a kind of pattern of activity for Jews in the 19th and 20th centuries, which runs something like this. By and large, Jews went into industries that were rapidly expanding, in which there was room for growth, that were favorable to family firms, to ethnic networks, that had opportunities for international trading. And one of the reasons why these new enterprises were so interesting to them and so appealing to them was that professional hierarchies had not yet gelled. So there was less discrimination and fewer barriers to entry. But over and above that, whatever the motivations for becoming art dealers, becoming art collectors, and they vary a lot from the protagonists I talk about. These are people who genuinely become art lovers and derive a tremendous sense of meaning and pleasure out of beauty.
So in terms of education, there was not really anything specific or formal. These people learned on the job or from what there was around them that could inform their knowledge.
Well, again, it's hard to generalize. There are a few Paul Cassirer in Berlin, Bernard Berenson in Boston, and eventually in Italy, who have formal training in art history. The difficulty was that art history was a relatively new discipline. It was far more advanced in Germany than it was anywhere else. If you had wanted to do a degree in art history, the history of art, at Oxford or Cambridge or any of Leeds, Manchester, and so forth, it would have been impossible. There was no such thing. So there are a few people who have formal training in art history. But for the most part, as you say, this is by experience. These are people who are self-taught. They learn about art by looking at countless pictures, drawings, works of sculpture, decorative art, by scouring museums and galleries. And one of the things which is astonishing about the stories is that these are people who really become true connoisseurs. They are not just flogging art in the way that you would flog another commodity, though art is, of course, on one level, a commodity. It's a thing bought and sold on the market. There is real love and real attachment there. We don't really quite understand how people acquire what we call eyes. But the people that I write about had astonishing eyes, and it's hard to believe that that was all experiential. There also must have been some kind of internal capacity. But over and above that, there is a kind of progression from earlier economic activities that Jews were involved in, whether it was assessing jewelry or selling furs, or in Nathan Wildenstein's case, selling horses. These were people who were alive to form, to quality, and to structure. And while there is no simple one-to-one relationship between these activities and art, it was a progression.
So you've mentioned, I think, for 3 or 4 of the people you've written about. Who else is significant that you identified? Can you share something about some of the other prime movers in the story you tell?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I found interesting about researching this story and about writing it is that it's a story of families, and it's a story of the rise and fall of families and of family conflicts. So let me give you an idea of just one of the families who loom large in the book. Alexandra Rosenberg, just to anglicize his name. He comes to Paris from Bratislava in the early 1870s at a moment of opportunity for Jews. The Third Republic is in force. Careers open to talent was one of its keynotes. We know very little about Alexandra when he came to Paris, but we can be pretty sure about one thing. The last thing on his mind was to become an art dealer or an art collector. Somehow or other, he becomes an extremely successful commodities broker. He gets a seat on the exchange, on the bourse. He raises a family in Paris. He is doing quite well for himself. And then in the mid-1880s, disaster strikes. He is a specialist in grain dealing, and enormous shipments of grain that he has being transported from Argentina rot in transit. And he is wiped out. He has really nothing left. And his only negotiable asset is a small but very fine collection of modern pictures. And really out of necessity, he becomes an art dealer. He starts out selling some Renaissance pictures, old masters, nothing particularly valuable, some decorative art. But he soon works his way into 19th century French painting. And Alexandra was very adventurous. And one day he is walking in Paris, in the northern section of the city with his young son Paul, and in a shop window on Rue Le Pelletier, he sees a picture that interests him. And it was a wild and vivid picture, so much so that the young boy, only 10 years old, begins to scream with horror. This doesn't really deter his father, who quiets him down and says he doesn't know the artist, but he wants to buy this picture. The picture turns out to be a Van Gogh, and we're talking about 1891. And Van Gogh was virtually unknown outside of the cognoscenti of the art world. So Alexandra is really adventurous and a man with superb taste. He bought pictures that were so unconventional that family friends laughed at them. They said, well, how can you have objects that are blue and yellow when no such thing exists in nature? But he buys Van Goghs, he buys Monets, he buys Renoirs, and he had superb taste. And his wife thought that he was a madman and that he was going to bankrupt them all over again. Around 1905, he decides that he is going to largely withdraw from the business. And he hands it over to his two eldest sons, Léonce and Paul. Both had lycée education, both had grown up in the gallery, both had a real feeling for art, and both had real commercial training. But the brothers were very different. Léonce was, in the words of his old schoolmate and fellow dealer René Gampel, he was tall and elegant like a pink shrimp. He was an idealist, a visionary. He fancied himself a great merchant, but unfortunately for him, he was not. His brother Paul was dark, and according to Gampel, he had the short, muzzled face of a fox and was just as crafty. He too was an art lover, but he was a more practical and prudent man than his brother. And he wanted to stick to the 19th century art that had been the mainstay of the family. And Léonce was restless. So the brothers part ways, and Léonce goes out on his own, and he begins to collect Cubist art.
Now we'll talk about Léonce and his interest in Cubism a little bit later, hopefully. You said when you began to describe the book that these various people knew each other. In terms of their business, did they act independently, or was the fact they were all Jewish useful in terms of a sort of social network, as it were, between them?
The social network is very important. I mean, I think you have to remember these are people who are outsiders. They have no place in the established institutions of the Paris art world, either the Academy of Fine Arts, which trained artists and set aesthetic standards, notions of beauty, and extolled history painting, or the Salon, which the offshoot of the Academy, which was the main venue for exhibiting art, which the place where artists learned to, or tried to carve out careers and to sell their canvases. Jews were not a part of this. And therefore, ethnic networks are particularly important. Let me just give you an example. In 1889, Nathan Wildenstein, who's by then pretty well launched as an art dealer, decides he needs a partner. And the man he chooses is a fellow Jew from Alsace, Ernest Gampel. And Ernest came from Strasbourg, not from a little village. He was much better educated than Nathan. But they were two Alsatian Jews who were finding their way in Paris. they ultimately go into partnership together, though they both maintain separate galleries. And as the century turns, the two of them decide to open Gampel and Wildenstein in New York. Ernest Gampel, who was a very charming and likable fellow, also spoke very good English, unlike Nathan. And unlike Nathan, he had the kind of spirit that made him want to travel to America. So it was Ernest who opens the gallery. And but the network goes even further, because when the Gampel and Wildenstein open their gallery in New York, one of the people they rely on are the Duvines, and in particular Henry Duveen, the kind of a wayward younger brother, who had been very troubled in his youth, whose older brother, Joel, sends to New York to open a gallery. And these people do business together. They work with Benjamin Altman, a department store magnate from a German Jewish family, who turns his father's very modest dry goods store into an extremely successful and enlightened department store. When Rene Gampel, Ernest's son, decides to marry, who does he marry? He marries one of the daughters of the Duvines, Florrie Duveen. So there are very close ties between these people. But this isn't, let me emphasize, a conspiracy. These are people who are working together when it suits them. And they also have conflicts between them. The Gampel-Wildenstein partnership is dissolved in 1919. Joe Duveen, who's one of the main characters in the book and was rightly called the most spectacular art dealer of the 20th century, a classic wheeler and dealer about whom there's a lot more to say. He and his brother-in-law, Rene Gampel, fall out. They don't speak to each other again. So there is cooperation, but there's also a lot of conflict within this network.
And of course, we are beginning now to see the emergence of some Jewish artists as well. So I wonder how important the fact that these dealers were Jewish was. What was the sort of general climate like in terms of anti-Semitism at that point in time?
Well, it depends a lot on where you look. I mean, anti-Semitism was a chronic feature of different national cultures. There was a spectrum from people who wanted to keep Jews out of their clubs, out of their professions, to limit their numbers in Oxford and Cambridge, for instance. And then there were the people who believed that Jews had no place in any European country. So there's a very wide variety, but let me give you an example. One of the families that I deal with in the book at some length are the Bernheims. Another Alexandra comes to Paris in the 1860s, becomes very successful selling 19th century French art. He hands the business over to his sons, and the sons decide that they want to turn the gallery into the Gallery Bernheim Jeune. The idea of youth, of what was on the continent called die Jungen, the young ones, the young painters who were spearheaded secessions in Vienna and to some extent in Berlin. So the brothers decide to become more and more involved in the battle for Impressionist painting and then for post-Impressionist painting. But they bump up against anti-Semitism in a variety of ways. The major reason is that they come of age during the Dreyfus Affair. And as they are moving into more contemporary forms of art, Paris and indeed the rest of the country is divided, savagely and bitterly divided along partisan lines. And there are the Dreyfusards, who were the supporters of the Republic, and there were the anti-Dreyfusards, who were generally speaking the supporters of the army and the church. It was a period in which anti-Semitism spiked. It spiked not only in the political world, but also in the Parisian avant-garde. And among the painters who was anti-Dreyfusard and quite anti-Semitic was Renoir, who made many deprecating remarks about Jews. Well, the brothers have a problem. They have to live in this world. They can't just sell their paintings to fellow Jews, and there aren't enough Jewish artists around to work only with Jewish artists. There's, Camille Pissarro, who's one of the great impressionists. They do indeed sell his works, but anti-Semitism is unavoidable. The brothers become engaged to the Sisters Adler in the year 1900, and they decide to give their fiancés a gift to commemorate their engagements. So the brothers look for a painter to paint their wives, their prospective wives, who were great beauties, and they turn to Renoir. And you would think, oh, will Renoir do this, given his anti-Semitism? And the answer was yes. And why would the Bernheims turn to him? Well, what happens is that Renoir ends up going to spend about 10 days, 2 weeks with the Adlers. And the young ladies charm him. And when he leaves, they are very good friends. And for the next years, Renoir becomes one of the kind of house painters chez Bernheim. Now, what does this really mean? Does it mean that he's no longer an anti-Semite? No, it doesn't. It just means that he makes an exception for practical reasons, for commercial reasons, and perhaps for individual reasons, because he likes the brothers, he particularly likes the sisters, and they like him. So anti-Semitism is very much part of this world. You can see it in a different way in Berlin. A couple of years, 1897, 1898, there's a avant-garde movement in Berlin called the Berlin Secession, which breaks away from the academy and which extols the virtues of French Impressionist painting, which was an unpopular thing to do in the wake of the enmity which provoked the Franco-Prussian War and the ongoing antagonism between France and Germany. Now, most of the people who are the painters who are involved in the secession are not Jews, but some of the most visible figures were. The leader of the secession was Max Liebermann, who came from a well-to-do Berlin Jewish family, never made any bones about where he came from. Was the best known of the modern painters in Germany at the time, and was significantly older than his young and largely non-Jewish colleagues. The secretaries of the secession, which really was they were the administrators, the driving force, were the cousins Cassiris, who were Jews. What is the reaction to this? Well, at first, the reaction is an extremely negative aesthetic reaction. Kaiser Wilhelm, who took an interest in art, loathed modern art, saw it as un-German, saw this art as departing from the standards of classical painting and was violating nature. And there is an uproar about the secession. But by the time we get to the run up to World War I, this reaction against this modernist painting takes on a distinctly ideological tinge. And Jews are identified with a modern art which is seen as un-German, which is taking away valuable commissions from German artists. And the Cassiras are seen as speculators in the so-called Jew-infested West End. And these are ideas that feed into anti-Semitism. And when the war begins, there's another twist to this, just very briefly, that Cubism is dismissed by French reactionaries as a German art, which is ludicrous. Was Picasso German? Was Braque German? No, but a number of the great supporters of Cubist art were German emigres. And there's another outburst of anti-Semitism. So at least from the Dreyfus Affair on, politics and art and the discourse about them are colored to one extent or another by anti-Semitism.
So you touched on the First World War. What was the impact of the war on the art trade and specifically on this group of dealers that you've mentioned?
Well, the impact is really twofold. First, it basically puts an end to transatlantic trade. Much of the transatlantic trade in art, the high end of the market anyway, is about old masters. People like the Duvines importing old master paintings, extremely valuable decorative art, Renaissance furniture, and so forth. But as boats are sunk, the dealers are understandably very fearful that irreplaceable, unique masterpieces will be lost forever. And that would be both an enormous aesthetic loss and a commercial loss. So the trade begins to trail off very significantly during the war. There's also a very significant effect of the art on the war on modern art, and in particular on the avant-garde. Paris, as you know, had become a magnet for artists, would-be artists, writers, collectors, intellectuals, students from all over the world. This includes a significant number of Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia, the likes of Soutine or Chagall or Modigliani from Livorno. It includes a troupe of Americans, among them a family of German Jewish origin, the Steins, who become very significant players in the world of avant-garde art. The avant-garde in Paris was nothing if not international and cosmopolitan. These were people who were bound together by aesthetic commitments. They were also bound together by the fact that they had to face a certain amount of neglect or indifference or derision. In 1914, they find themselves in an impossible position. The avant-garde is dispersed. If you are a Spaniard like Juan Gris, what are you going to do? Are you going to stay in France? If you stay in France, will you be regarded as an alien, an outsider? Do you go back to Spain? There's a wonderful little vignette that Picasso takes his friend and co-founder of Cubism, Georges Braque, to a railway station. Braque enlists early and fights rather courageously during the war, and Picasso commented then, "We never saw each other again." Well, that was patently untrue. They certainly saw each other again. What was true, though, was that the kind of close relationship they had was shattered. So what you see is nationalist hatred undermining the kind of internationalist, cosmopolitan bonds of the avant-garde, and these feelings spill over into the post-war era. Paul Cassira, who was a man of the left, a man who fought for Germany during the war, despite the fact that he was in his early 40s and was decorated for bravery, and then became a pacifist. After the war, dealers that he had worked with for many years in Paris simply refused to receive him.
And what happened after the war? Who was selling? Who was buying? Were the patterns of trade changed at all?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that happened after the war. Picasso, the leader of the Parisian avant-garde, who, along with Braque, as I said, spearheaded Cubism, makes one of his many aesthetic turns, and he becomes interested in neoclassical painting. And in the French tradition of Ingres, Corot, and others. So there are some big aesthetic changes. After the war, Paris bounces back fairly quickly. There are times in which the market is good, times in which it's bad, like any other market, because of the economic fluctuations of the 1920s. But it depends really where you look. Generally, though, modern art advances after the war in a very significant way. And one of the stock explanations for this is that the war discredited many conventional ideas, institutions, and beliefs, and made people receptive to new forms of aesthetic expression. And there's some truth to that.
Now, mindful of the time, we should really talk about the Second World War
Sure.
too, because it's pretty significant. What can you tell us about the Dusseldorf bombing and the impact that it had?
So on April 1st, 1933, only months after Hitler had come to power, the Nazis organized plan a boycott of Jewish-owned shops, which is slated to take place on April 1st, 1933. And 3 weeks before them, in the city of Dusseldorf, a group of Nazi thugs decide to take matters into their own hands. And they bomb an auction which was being organized by Alfred Flestheim, one of my own favorite characters in the book, a grain dealer turned modern art dealer, and by two of his friends. No one is badly hurt. No work of art is destroyed. But this is an unmistakable signal of things to come. A couple of friends, as partisans of the modern movement, leave Germany. And what the bombing shows is the ways in which Nazis identified modern art with Jews and condemned both. Eventually, this became known as entartete Kunst, or degenerate art. So it is a very worrying augur of things to come.
And although the Nazis believed this art to be degenerate, they organized an exhibition of it, and they also seemed very keen to get their hands on it. So why would that be?
Well, the exhibition, which begins in Munich in 3 days,
We've got a signal problem.
Yeah.
In parts of the Reich.
Charles, just say that again. We lost you for a minute. We lost you for a minute or so. Just start that.
Sorry. So the Degenerate Art Show begins in Munich in July 1937, and it ends up going around the Third Reich, where it attracts millions of visitors. And what is this about? Well, it was anything but a glorification of modern art. In the mid-1930s, the Nazis begin to purge German universities, German museums, and German galleries. And those who are purged are not only Jews, though they are the principal target, but also those who are partisans of modern art. And in 1936-37, they begin to purge approximately 16,000 works of modern art that had been acquired by and displayed by German museums and galleries, which shows the kind of inroads modern art was actually making in Germany. And the idea behind this was racial purification. These modern works of art were considered degenerate. They were tied to Jews, to Bolshevism. They were seen as a racial threat to the so-called good German Aryans. And displaying these works was an attempt to excoriate them, to degrade them, to humiliate them, to arouse anger on the part of the public by showing how much museums had paid for this art with the so-called the money, the pennies of good German workers. So the point of the exhibit is to elicit rage. It also becomes a prelude to just simply destroying some of these works of art, but also to selling them. Why did they sell them? Well, they did one or two things with these works of art when they could. One was they sold them on the open market for hard currency which was going to be used in the war effort, or they traded them for so-called Northern Old Masters, whether it was Holbeins or Rembrandts or, in some very rare cases, Vermeers. So that's why they got hold of these works of art. There were a couple of Nazi bigwigs, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador to Britain, and then the foreign secretary, who really admired modern art. But for the most part, this was out of favor with the Nazi brass.
Just to remind our audience, if you have questions for Charles, please do put them into the Q&A in the next few minutes. Some of the accounts of the theft of assets are pretty shocking to read. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the book is the lengths that the dealers went to hide their collections and to keep them out of reach of the Nazis. Were any of them actually successful in hanging on to their collections?
Very few. I mean, I'll give you just one example, Paul Rosenberg. So Paul Rosenberg turns to modern art and to the avant-garde, and specifically to Picasso, right at the end of the First World War. And by the time the Second World War begins, he is the dealer for both Picasso and Matisse, the two great stars of the Paris art world. By then, he has established very close links with fledgling American museums, above all the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but also the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut. And by chance, many of his Picassos and some of his Matisses were in the United States when the war began, and they were safe. But for the most part, Paul hid his art in 3 different places, all of which were looted by the Nazis. What tended to happen was that competitors, Nazi collaborators, tried to ferret out the location of the art as a way of profiting from the sale of the art or ingratiating themselves with the Nazis. So while a relatively small number of works of art were safeguarded, there was massive looting, as we know.
And what did they do with it all? Where did they put all this art that they stole?
Well, they put it in different places. One of the places they put it was in the Jeu de Paume, this little jewel of a museum in the Tuileries Gardens in Paris, which had been used mostly for exhibits of modern art, whether French or international. And they used it as a depot. Sometimes the art would be sent to Germany or Austria or the Czech lands. Very often it was kept for Nazi bigwigs, for the likes of Goering, who was a frequent visitor to the museum. And whenever he came, he plucked off some of the most valuable works of art. But works of art end up in different places. They end up in salt mines. They end up in a monastery outside of Munich, in a small town called Buxheim. And many of them also end up in the hands of Hitler and Goering, who were the two biggest beneficiaries of Nazi art theft.
And you mentioned this renaissance in interest in these artworks in the late 1990s. What inspired that?
I think first and foremost, the interest in the Holocaust moving from the margins to the center of public consciousness, thanks to memoirs, museums, memorials. Second, the interest in Nazi gold and the realization that Jews had opened accounts in Swiss banks, and the Swiss banks confiscated their funds. They did not give them back to their heirs in most cases after the war. And when that came out, there began to be interest in what else the Nazis ransacked. On a more general level, you'll also see the aging of Jewish survivors, and this kind of this interest in recovering some kind of symbol or vestige or emblem of a vanished past. And on a more material level, you had an extremely hot art market. So if you had say a Monet's Water Lilies 1904, which had been ransacked for you, that was a painting worth millions, and a painting worth trying to get back.
And yet you mentioned that European governments, I think you particularly draw attention to the Dutch government, still are holding on to large amounts of looted art, indeed holding an exhibition of it. How is this possible? It seems beyond belief that it's still there, and is even being sort of paraded as looted art.
Well, to be fair to the Dutch, they are by no means the only culprit in this story. This is something that we still see all over Europe. And, the complication is that sometimes works of art were bought in good faith and in good conscience, and that they were not works of art that had been directly looted by the Nazis. There's a lot of complication in all of this because when works of art were recovered by the so-called monuments, fine arts, and archives officers, both British and American, after the war, there was the question of what do we do with them? They didn't have the local knowledge necessary to ferret out the owners or to return them. So they return these works of art to their government, to their country of origin, and specifically to national governments. These national governments were in the midst of reconstruction projects, which were enormously daunting. But on a less salubrious level, they saw these works of art not as the sacked or looted property of Jews or their heirs, but as parts of their own national heritage. And there were certainly attempts by national commissions, notably in France, to return art in the immediate aftermath of the war, but this is largely over by the end of the 1940s, as other concerns, notably the Cold War, begin to assert themselves. So individual families continue to try to get their art back, but they are stonewalled. And we see this in a number of famous cases, including the story of the Maria Altman's attempt to regain the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, 1907, by Gustav Klimt, which had been owned by her aunt Adele, who was the subject.
Do we have any idea about how much art is still missing or hasn't been returned to its rightful owners? Is it
Well,
the majority?
I think the answer is in the thousands. There's a commission on looted art, which is co-chaired by Anne Weber, who's done a wonderful job. There is a commercial company called the Art Loss Register in London. And because of digital technology, it is much easier to register a claim for stolen art than it was in an earlier generation, when you had to really just hope that something turned up in a museum catalog or by chance.
We have a question from Yvonne Cheney. She's one of our viewers in Southern California. Yvonne says, having seen in person the 5 Klimt paintings at the Neue Gallery in New York, how pleased I was to see the movie about how they were eventually returned to the right owner. Are there many ancestors? Are there many looking for paintings which were confiscated from their ancestors?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are court cases that are ongoing. One of my friends here, who comes from a German Jewish family, believes that his family owned Bruegels that were stolen during the war, and he is trying to pursue these claims. But it is a very difficult thing to do. That unless something is located in a museum collection, or we know the contents of a private collection, it's still extraordinarily hard to find works of art. And when you do find works of art, let's say in a German museum, or just for instance, then the question is, well, who owns it? Why wasn't this claim filed earlier? Do you have documentation? And the people who have been most successful in recovering their art, by and large, were the big-time dealers and collectors. They tended to have documentation, bills of sale, photographic archives, and some of them were very well connected. When a Rothschild walked into the commission, the National Commission on Art Recuperation in Paris, you can be sure that Rothschild was not going to get short shrift, because almost certainly this was someone who would have friends in the world of government. And smaller dealers, or more often collectors, who might have had one or two paintings, were in a much more difficult position. And this isn't simply because of snobism or money. Well, money is important because actually it is important because the amount of resources it takes to follow up a claim to press a legal case.
Mm. Now, towards the end of the book, very near the end, you say, was it any wonder that the sudden prominence of Jews from all over Europe, who seemingly came out of nowhere, fed into a paranoid fear of an international conspiracy that had to be stopped at all costs? And mindful, a couple of weeks ago, walking around the Frieze art exhibition in London, there are Jewish collectors wandering around, but there don't seem to be Jewish galleries, Jewish dealers, or certainly not to the major extent that that was the case prior to the Second World War. And I wondered if you thought that was a bad thing or really just inevitable as other professions began to open up to Jews, and perhaps they could do things that were more interesting than being an art dealer. I don't know.
Well, I mean, personally, I think being an art dealer is an extremely interesting, though by no means easy profession. Do I think it's a good thing? I mean, I do think as you suggested, Jonathan, the happy part of this story that as certain discriminatory barriers were lowered and Jews were able and are able to move into a variety of occupations and professions, that is something that we should all welcome. In the case of Jews, as in other minorities, there are still significant numbers of Jewish dealers and Jewish collectors. They may not be as visible as they once were. One of the reasons why they were so visible is that there's a cluster of Jews who congregate in the art world in the late 19th and early 20th century. The difficulty is that visibility increased vulnerability, and that when you had a critical mass of Jews who were suddenly becoming prominent figures, it provoked or became a pretext for a furious backlash from anti-Semites, reactionaries, and from competitors. So my own feeling is that we are all better off when every profession, every occupation is open to all comers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm inclined to agree with you, and I think a suitable point to end our discussion. Charles, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. If you want to buy this book, and I think what's remarkable about this book is the incredible detail of events of so long ago, even down to conversations people had and emotions people felt. It really is remarkably researched. If you want to buy it, there's a link on the email we'll send you tomorrow, also on our website. If you buy it with the link, it'll help Milim with a few pennies, but won't cost you any more. The book, of course, is available elsewhere too. And to say thank you to you, Charles, I'm going to send you a book of some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action in Israel. So hopefully you'll enjoy reading that. That will might take a little while to get to you, but it will definitely be on the way. Now, just before we go, a few words about our upcoming program. Next week we have Mike Levy. He's discussing his book, Get the Children Out: The Unsung Heroes of the Kindertransport. So we've all heard of Sir Nicholas Winston. He was responsible for just 6% of the Kinder, and this book is about some of those who rescued the other 94%. And I'm really looking forward to chatting with him. With A Following Wind, we will be live from Haifa next week. Then on the 14th of November, we're delighted to welcome Mark Ludwig, who's director of the Terezin Music Foundation. His presentation, Our Will to Live, Art and Music in Terezin, looks at the astonishing artistic community that arose in the Theresienstadt Nazi camp. We have a special event on the 21st of November. Some of you will be aware that we had a physical event with Limas Bredis from the Lithuanian embassy, speaking about Lithuanian history from a Jewish perspective, and the Zoom didn't work. So for all of those who want to watch that at home, he will be our guest on the 21st of November. And having heard his presentation before, I can vouch for how interesting it is. More is coming. Please visit milim.org.uk. Be sure to sign up to our newsletter and make sure you don't miss anything. As always, all Milim events are free, but you can make a donation to support the cost of putting these events on. There's a link in the chat. It's also on our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Charles Dellheim. Once again, thank you so much, Charles. It's really been fascinating.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and all best to everyone who is listening.
Thank you, and looking forward to seeing all of you at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.